Hey there, Georgie here with Ukraine Matters. Crimea, right before our eyes, is turning to an island. Ukraine has only just begun its campaign against the Russians that are now stuck in Crimea, but already the results are astonishing. So let's look today at what is happening there and other parts of the front line to see whether or not Russians have any chance to keep up. So what we need to understand is the situation in Crimea has deteriorated very quickly. If we look at the peninsula, we will very quickly find out that if we zoom in, then there is only just a number of entrances, so to say, to Crimea, which Ukrainians promptly started attacking. We saw multiple videos of Ukrainians both striking bridges that are leading to Crimea, but also trying to take out trucks that are trying to cross whatever additional options Russians are putting up to try to go over, not over the bridges that were bombed, but in some other ways. And this creates, once again, delays and big problems with logistics. Even if there is a road that is leading to Crimea, it is narrow, and if there is like a truck that's being exploded right on top of it, then suddenly that road is not really usable anymore. So Ukrainians already created massive issues in the north of Crimea, and then there was a bit of a hope, sort of, for Russians that maybe something that can be done. They really decided to take two big and important steps. Step number one that was done by Russians is trying to control the entrances to Crimea. What Russians did basically is they started pulling in more and more air defense units in the area, which created a lot of issues for the Russians, because the reality is if you start concentrating your good enough air defense forces in the area leading to Crimea, you're exposing the front line, because all of these units are needed on the front line. And right now, Russians are in dilemma. So that was the first thing. However, we also have something that is called like an interactive map of fuel in Crimea. And if those units that were relocated to this area in Crimea would help, then what we would expect to see is that north of Crimea would start seeing some kind of improvement in their situation with fuel. That did not happen. But we did saw some improvements, marginal improvements, around the eastern part of Crimea. And that was interesting because the first idea was that maybe, just maybe, there was finally some fuel being moved all across the Kerch Bridge. Now, Russians are very scared to do so because last time when there was a strike against the Kerch Bridge, there was also some fuel train that was going across the bridge, and this created very extensive damage deep inside the bridge structure. So since then, fuel is not really allowed to go over Crimean Bridge. Instead, it was forced to take the ferry. However, last night, Ukrainians actually struck the ferry itself. So now, today, we have final reports that in Crimea, there is no more fuel being distributed, period. No more like some cards, no more any kind of underhanded tactics. There is no fuel unless you are military in Crimea, period. So Crimea, by this point, is already, at least in this aspect, is considered an island. And the most important thing is that this is just the June month. Russia has no idea what's coming for it. This is just the first couple of weeks that Ukraine started this campaign. And the systemic campaign is showing more and more results. Russians are reporting that in south of Crimea, they're having more and more issues. Ukrainians are continuing their attacks, specifically around the southern part of Crimea. We're talking around Zaporizhia, we're talking around just south of Pokrovsk, because, as I said, Russia is pulling their air defense troops from less important parts of the front line, because Russia wants to concentrate only specifically on Konstantinivka, but even in Konstantinivka they're actually having issues. Recently, we got news that it was actually new Syrski's units that he assembled sort of to be in direct control of him that made their way to Konstantinivka, and right now there is heavy fighting in the town and Russian advances have pretty much stopped. So now there is a big question mark whether Russia can achieve anything at all. Guys, it's impossible to underscore just how big the Russian problems with fuel are becoming. Not just in Crimea, but in territories that are next to Ukraine at all. There are constant news about Russia having issues in the Rostov region, the Krasnodar region, around Belgorod and Voronezh. There is also questions right now. And we already saw the lines forming around Moscow with Ukraine striking the biggest Russian oil refinery that is specifically aimed to deliver fuel to Moscow. And now, just recently, we heard news that Ukraine struck too many oil refineries, which are some 2,000 kilometers away from front lines in Ukraine. Russia has no idea just how bad it's going to get. And you know what's the best part? That the response from Putin on all of the things that Ukraine is doing has been pretty much silence. Russians and Russian Z propagandists are furious that Putin is not taking actions. And I believe this is what is being exploited by Zelensky a lot. We see that with the renewed sort of diplomatic effort, these diplomatic efforts are different from the ones that were happening last year, because last year everyone was trying to kind of dance around Trump. This year, the messaging from Ukraine is very different. It's sort of they don't even really care what Trump does. Instead, they're trying to kind of message to the Russian oligarchy, trying to underscore that, hey, we're trying to get going some kind of a peace process, yet it is Putin that is not doing his part. And they are also now stating that it's going to get more and more problematic for you. And once again, Zelensky, almost after every strike, is reiterating that diplomatic path is open. It is very clear that Ukraine is targeting specifically some kind of groups in Russia that can try to undermine Putin. So it's very interesting to see how diplomacy is intertwined here with Ukrainians doing these strikes that are hurting Russian economy as well. So Putin's response, as I said in the media, was no response whatsoever. And it seems that this is becoming Putin's policy altogether. Because what we saw in the videos when the drones struck oil refinery in Russia, specifically in Moscow, is that we saw drones flying, guns shooting, we saw missiles flying, but there was no siren. And the same is also happening right now in Crimea. What Russia and Putin specifically are doing is basically stating that if there is no sort of a problem, if we do not see the problem, then there is no problem. Russia is basically closing their eyes, says, I see no evil, and then puts some fingers in their ears and goes, la, 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 nothing is happening, everything is fine. That is the policy of Putin in response to Ukrainian systemic campaign of destruction of their economic and approval base. And it is working. Once again, I want to underscore that we are just in the month of June. Ukraine has only begun. I truly believe that if this is how it's going to continue, then by the end of summer, Russians should be expecting to have a very, very different perspective on the war. Already now, we read from Z propagandists that, it's unclear whether it's us doing the special military operation or it's being done against us. Right now, the discussion is not that Ukraine will strike or will not strike something. It sort of now is accepted as inevitability that, for example, Crimean bridge will get struck by Ukraine. Russians are discussing in their channels saying is like, well, when that finally happens, we're gonna get really screwed. They're kind of like stopped even imagining that Ukraine will not strike it. And the best part of all of this is that Russian system is undermining itself altogether. So Russia is pretend state. They don't really have the rule of law. but they have certain principles that are being operated on. And one of the principles is that at least maybe we can sort of get insured against these Ukrainian strikes, and therefore we can kind of write off some of the damages that Ukrainians are doing, so we can renew working with our fuel infrastructure. That is the Russian oil companies, private oil companies are thinking. There has been litigation inside of Russia. Again, not real courts, but still, there has been litigation. And in that litigation, the courts in Russia have now started to say that we cannot accept that Ukrainian strikes on the oil refineries can be considered sort of like unexpected circumstances. We cannot allow this case anymore. Now, should be already expected by the company that is operating in the fuel industry that the Ukrainians will strike and that these things can happen because it's a part of the systemic environment inside of Russia. I was surprised as much as you when I heard about these court orders. Putin is sinking into complete delusion. He is basically stating that everything is good, Russia is winning everywhere on the front line. We talked over everything on the front line where Russia was only winning in Konstantinivka, and even now Konstantinivka, thanks to the actions of the commander Syrsky, is now a big question mark where Ukrainians are counterattacking. Ukrainians are conducting their counteroffensive operations. Unfortunately, Z propagandists haven't reported new Ukrainian advances, so I cannot share with you what was happening because they were preoccupied with the strikes against Moscow, but do know that things are going well. And I want to underscore one last time that this is just the first month of Ukrainian campaign, and we still have the whole summer coming. Thank you so much for watching this, guys. I love you. Slava Ukraini, trust in Ukrainian armed forces, and I'll see you next time.